Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. I've been driving trucks for 15 years, hauling everything from produce to heavy machinery across the country. My name's Lyle Hargrove, and I've seen more of the back roads of America than most people care to think about. But nothing, and I mean nothing, compares to what happened that day out on Route 218, near a small, forgotten town called Fairhope. I was on a routine run, a load of steel pipes headed to a construction site in Louisiana. It was supposed to be a simple trip, the kind where I'd clock in, drive a few hundred miles, unload, and head back. I had the radio on, classic rock humming low, and a thermos of coffee within reach. The road was empty, just how I like it. But as I neared Fairhope, the GPS started acting up, rerouting, recalculating, the usual glitches. I didn't think much of it. I'd been on these roads long enough to know my way without any tech. Fairhope wasn't even on the map, just a speck, a place people might have driven through without ever stopping. The kind of town where you get one or two stores, a diner, and not much else. But when I rolled through, something felt off. The streets were too quiet. No kids playing, no dogs barking, just nothing. It was like the town was holding its breath. As I eased the rig through the narrow streets, I saw a man standing by the side of the road. He was dressed in dirty work clothes, maybe a mechanic or a farmhand. Something about him wasn't right. He was too still, just staring at the truck, following it with his eyes as I passed by. His face was rough like he hadn't shaved in days, and his hair was matted with sweat and dirt. The closer I got, the more uneasy I felt, like he could see right through the steel of the cab and into my head. I shook it off and kept driving, chalking it up to the weird vibes that sometimes come with small towns. About 5 miles out of Fairhope, the road narrowed into a single lane, flanked by dense woods on either side. My mind started drifting, and before I knew it, the truck sputtered and died, dead in the middle of nowhere. I cursed under my breath, grabbed my flashlight, and hopped out to check under the hood. The engine wasn't overheated, nothing seemed out of place, but it wouldn't start. I couldn't afford to waste time, so I decided to take a walk back to town, see if I could find someone to help. The sun was setting as I trudged back toward Fairhope, the sky turning that deep orange that bleeds into night. That's when I heard it. A low metallic creaking, like an old barn door swinging in the wind. I stopped and listened, but it was gone. I kept walking, a little faster now, and that's when I saw the man again. The same one from before. He was just standing there in the middle of the road, blocking my path. "Need some help?" he asked, his voice rough like gravel. There was no warmth in it, no concern, just a flat, cold tone that sent a chill up my spine. "I'm good, just need to get back to town," I replied, trying to sound casual. But something about him kept me on edge. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, staring. "Not much in Fairhope," he said, a thin smile creeping onto his face. "But I can get you back there if you want." I was about to decline, tell him I'd be fine on my own, but then he started walking toward me, slow and deliberate. His clothes looked even dirtier up close, stained with what I first thought was oil. But as he got closer, I realized it was something else, blood, dried, crusted, and smeared on his shirt and hands. I took a step back, my instincts screaming at me to run. "You all right, man?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a knife. It was old, the blade chipped and rusted, but sharp enough to do damage. I didn't wait to find out what he intended to do with it. I turned and ran, bolting back toward the truck as fast as I could. I could hear his footsteps behind me, heavy and relentless. The trees blurred as I sprinted down the road, my lungs burning, my heart pounding. I could still hear that creaking sound, closer now, but I didn't dare look back. When I finally reached the truck, I scrambled into the cab, slammed the door, and locked it. My hands were shaking as I tried the ignition again. Nothing. The engine was dead, and that creaking sound was getting louder, closer. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw him, the man standing right behind the truck. He was grinning, that knife glinting in the dim light. I had no choice. I grabbed the tire iron from under the seat, swung open the door, and jumped out, ready to defend myself. But he didn't move. He just stood there, watching, waiting for me to make the first move. I tightened my grip on the tire iron, my knuckles white, and took a step forward. "What the hell do you want?" I shouted, the fear in my voice making me sound weak. He smiled wider, showing teeth that were chipped and yellowed. "I want to help," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. I swung the tire iron hard, aiming for his head, but he was faster than he looked. He ducked, and before I could react, he lunged at me, the knife slashing through the air. I barely dodged it, the blade grazing my arm, drawing blood. The pain was sharp, but it fueled my desperation. I swung again, this time connecting with his shoulder. He grunted in pain, but didn't go down. Instead, he grabbed my arm and twisted, forcing me to drop the tire iron. The knife flashed again, and I knew I was out of time. But then, out of nowhere, headlights flooded the road. A pickup truck barreled down the lane, its horn blaring. The man hesitated just for a second, and that's all I needed. I kicked him hard in the chest, sending him stumbling back into the ditch. The truck skidded to a stop, and an older man jumped out, shotgun in hand. "Get in!" he yelled at me, his eyes wide with panic. I didn't need to be told twice. I jumped into the passenger seat, and we tore out of there, the tires kicking up gravel as we sped away. As we drove, I looked back, expecting to see the man chasing us. But he was gone, vanished into the night. The older man didn't say a word, just kept driving until we reached the outskirts of another town, this one with people, lights, and life. "Who was that?" I asked, my voice shaky. "Don't know," the man replied, his hands tight on the wheel. "But he's been out there for years. Nobody knows where he came from, but he ain't right. Best thing you can do is forget about him." I nodded, too tired and too shaken to argue. When we finally reached a gas station, I thanked the man, who only nodded before driving off. I got a tow truck to retrieve my rig, and after the police took my statement, I left Fairhope behind. That was the last time I ever took Route 218. I've heard stories since, about a drifter in dirty clothes who haunts the back roads, waiting for the next unlucky soul. But they're just stories, right? I'm not one to dwell on what-ifs or could-have-beens. All I know is that I'm still here, still driving, and that's enough for me. In 1991, I was just trying to keep my life simple. I'm Ron Lacroix, and at the time I thought I had everything figured out. I didn't need much, just a bit of land out in the middle of nowhere, a cabin, and my own company. People always talked about getting away from it all, but for me it wasn't just talk. I was done with the noise, the people, and the stress. If you asked me why I moved off the grid in the first place, I'd tell you it wasn't some philosophical journey about finding myself or any of that nonsense. Honestly, it was more like escaping everyone else. I wasn't antisocial exactly, but let's just say I got along better with trees than with people. So I bought a small plot of land deep in the mountains of western Montana. Nearest town, about a 2-hour drive through a winding maze of barely paved roads. Civilization didn't call, and I didn't answer. The locals, the few who knew of me, thought I was either crazy or running from something. I wasn't, but their suspicion amused me. I preferred being a mystery, a rumor in town folklore. My cabin wasn't much, but it had the essentials. It's not like I was one of those guys building an apocalypse bunker. I wasn't paranoid. Just someone who liked a quiet life with his dog, Charlie, a mutt with more courage than brains. I had a small generator for electricity, though I rarely used it. The place was cozy, if a bit creaky from the constant cold. One evening I was out chopping wood near the tree line, feeling the chill creep into my bones. It was early September, but up in the mountains it might as well have been winter already. As usual, Charlie was sniffing around the woods, darting in and out of the trees, probably chasing a squirrel or something. "Charlie, get back here," I hollered, mostly out of habit. The dog listened when he felt like it, and this wasn't one of those times. He had this knack for ignoring me whenever he caught a scent that was more interesting than anything I had to offer. Now, I had lived out here for a couple of years by that point, and I'd seen just about every kind of wildlife Montana had to offer. Bears? Plenty of them. Wolves? Sure. Mountain lions, once or twice. But there was something different about that night. The air felt wrong. It wasn't just the cold. It was like the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting. I kept chopping wood, trying to ignore the feeling creeping up my spine. You ever get that sensation, like someone's watching you? Yeah, it was like that. And in the middle of nowhere, that feeling doesn't just spook you. It makes you feel real small. I'm not a superstitious guy, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was off. Then Charlie's barking turned frantic. Not the usual yapping he did when he found a rabbit, but a deep, panicked sound that sent a jolt through me. I dropped the axe and headed into the trees, calling his name, my voice bouncing off the silent pines. "Charlie, come on, boy, where are you?" I followed the sound of his barking until it stopped, sudden, like someone flipped a switch. That's when I started to worry. Charlie wasn't the kind of dog to just stop barking, not unless something shut him up. I found him a few minutes later, standing stock still, his fur bristling, staring at something I couldn't see. The moonlight barely filtered through the trees, casting jagged shadows over the ground. I didn't see anything at first, but then, just beyond the tree line, I spotted it. At first I thought it was a deer, a large one, judging by the way it moved. But it didn't move like any animal I'd seen before. It was fast, but its limbs seemed wrong. Like it was loping along at an awkward, unnatural angle. It didn't make a sound, not a single twig snapped as it moved. That was the part that unnerved me the most. You ever seen a predator that knows exactly how to stalk its prey? This thing, whatever it was, moved like that. Silent, deliberate. But it wasn't hunting a deer. It was looking at me. And I swear I could feel its focus shift in my direction. Charlie growled low in his throat. He wasn't scared easily, but he backed up, never taking his eyes off the thing. And when Charlie got nervous, I knew it was time to be worried. I grabbed a thick branch off the ground. Not that it'd do much if this thing decided to charge, but it made me feel better to have something in my hands. The creature stayed just out of sight, like it was testing me, deciding if I was worth the effort. Then it made a noise. Not a howl or a growl, but a weird, deep clicking sound that set my teeth on edge. It sounded almost like an insect, but far too loud, too deliberate. It echoed through the trees, making the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I didn't want to find out what made that sound. I started backing away, pulling Charlie with me, but he wouldn't budge. The damn dog was rooted to the spot, fixated on the thing. I cursed under my breath and gave a sharp tug on his collar, finally getting him to move. We turned and headed back toward the cabin, moving faster than I probably should have, but every instinct was screaming at me to get out of there. I glanced back once, just before we hit the clearing. The thing was closer now. And it wasn't a deer. It was big. Bigger than any predator I'd ever seen in these woods. It had the body of something hunched, like a bear with mangled limbs, but its head was flat and wide, with a neck that twisted unnaturally as it followed me. Its skin, if you could even call it that, looked more like bark, rough and knotted, blending with the trees as if it belonged to them. I didn't think. I ran. Charlie finally bolted after me, his tail tucked between his legs, which told me more than anything else that we were in serious trouble. By the time we reached the cabin, I was out of breath, my heart pounding in my ears. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and grabbed the shotgun I kept propped up next to the fireplace. Not that I'd ever needed it before, but tonight I wasn't taking chances. I stood there, staring at the door, listening. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of my own breathing. Then I heard it. That clicking again. Closer now, right outside the cabin. It was circling the place, moving around the perimeter, but it never came into the light of the windows. Smart, whatever it was. Too smart for an animal. I stayed like that for hours, the shotgun in my hands, Charlie whimpering at my feet. The thing didn't leave. It just waited. Clicking, 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 like it was toying with me, knowing I couldn't do a damn thing about it. At some point, exhaustion won out. I don't know how long I was out, but when I woke up, the sun was just beginning to creep over the horizon. For a brief, blissful moment, I thought it was over, that maybe the thing had given up. But then I saw the door. Something had scratched at it. Deep gouges running from the bottom to the top, like it had tried to get in. But here's the thing. No animal I know of could leave marks like that. They were too precise, too deliberate, like someone had taken a knife and carved into the wood. That's when I saw the bodies. Out in the yard, just beyond the cabin's front steps, were the remains of 2 deer, or what was left of them. They were torn apart, scattered across the ground in a gruesome display. But it wasn't the sight of the blood or the mangled bodies that made my stomach churn. It was the fact that their heads were missing, clean gone, as if something had just taken them. I don't know what that thing was, but it wasn't done with me. I could feel it. It was still out there, waiting for the right moment to come back. And when it did, I'd be ready. Or at least, I thought I would be. Turns out, the thing had other plans. Later that afternoon, when I finally worked up the nerve to go outside, I noticed something hanging from the trees near the edge of the clearing. It was the heads. 3 of them now. They dangled from the branches by thick knotted vines, swinging slightly in the mountain breeze. The sight of them nearly stopped my heart. It wasn't just that the heads were there. It was the way they were placed, like trophies, as if something or someone wanted me to see them. 2 deer, and 1 more I couldn't immediately identify. It was too mangled, too distorted, as if it had been changed. I backed away, my mind racing, trying to make sense of it all. Who or what would do this? Was it just a wild animal? No, animals didn't leave heads strung up like ornaments. This was deliberate, calculated. The first thing I did was check the cabin perimeter again. The scratches on the door were even worse in the daylight. Thick gouges, almost as if a blade had carved into the wood. But I knew that wasn't possible. I had seen what was out there. No human had done this, and no regular predator I'd ever encountered could have left those kinds of marks. Then my eyes fell on the 3rd head. I hesitated for a moment, my stomach churning. I didn't want to get closer, didn't want to see it for what it was, but my legs seemed to move on their own, pulling me toward the grim display. The head was hanging lower than the others, and as I stepped up to it, I realized why. It wasn't a deer. It was human. For a second, I thought I was going to throw up. The sight was worse up close. The skin was pale and bloated, the features twisted in agony. Whoever this poor bastard was, he'd been dead a while. His face was so disfigured I could hardly recognize anything distinct. But there was something familiar about his clothing, the torn fabric barely clinging to his torso. I took a deep breath and tried to steady myself, but my mind was racing. I hadn't seen anyone around my land in months. This wasn't someone from the town. I would have heard about a missing person. So who the hell was this? And how had he ended up out here? Before I could gather my thoughts, Charlie started barking again, his fur bristling. I whipped around, my heart thudding in my chest, half expecting to see that creature charging at me. But the yard was empty. Nothing. The only sound was the wind whistling through the trees and the distant clicking I had started to hate. Charlie wasn't barking at nothing. I trusted that dog's instincts more than my own. Slowly I scanned the tree line, looking for any sign of movement, any hint of what might be watching us. Then I saw it, just a flicker of something darting between the trees. It was fast, too fast to make out, but it was there. I raised the shotgun and took a few steps back, my pulse pounding in my ears. My hands were shaking, but I wasn't about to show it. Whatever this thing was, it was playing games with me, toying with me, but I wasn't about to let it win. "Come on then," I muttered under my breath, half hoping it wouldn't take me up on the offer. The clicking stopped. For a long, agonizing moment, there was silence. Then the air shifted, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The cabin loomed behind me, safety just a few feet away, but something told me running back inside wouldn't save me. Not this time. I heard the snap of a twig, and then it was on me. It moved so fast I barely had time to react. One moment I was standing there, shotgun ready, and the next I was knocked off my feet, the wind knocked out of me as I hit the ground hard. The creature, whatever it was massive, a blur of fur and twisted limbs. It felt like a freight train slamming into me. I struggled to get a good look at it, but all I could make out were flashes of dark matted fur and the sharp, sickening scent of rot. Its weight pressed down on me, and for a moment I was sure I was about to die. I fumbled for the shotgun, my fingers scrambling for the trigger as the creature's claws tore at me, shredding my jacket like it was tissue paper. Charlie lunged at the thing, barking like a maniac, sinking his teeth into its flank. The creature let out a deep, chittering noise, not quite a scream, but close enough. It swung its massive arm, sending Charlie flying into the trees with a sickening thud. I didn't have time to think. My hand finally found the trigger and I pulled. The blast echoed through the clearing, loud enough to make my ears ring. The creature reared back, its body twitching violently as the shot tore into its side. For a moment, I thought I'd won. It staggered, its limbs spasming, and I scrambled to my feet, ready to fire again. But the thing didn't stay down. It was like the wound only slowed it down, as if pain wasn't enough to stop it. It straightened up, its twisted body shuddering, and I saw its face for the first time, flat, wide, with a mouth that stretched far too long across its skull. The closest thing I could compare it to was a giant hairless bat, but even that didn't do it justice. It looked wrong, unnatural, like something that had never been meant to exist in this world. My second shot went off just as it lunged at me again, this time aiming for my throat. I barely dodged in time, the creature's claws raking across my shoulder, hot blood spilling down my arm. Pain shot through me, but adrenaline kept me moving. I fired again, this time hitting it square in the chest. The creature let out another chittering noise, collapsing to the ground with a final grotesque twitch. I didn't wait to see if it would get back up. I staggered to my feet, gripping the shotgun tightly, my vision swimming from the blood loss. Charlie limped back toward me, his tail between his legs, but alive. I didn't have the strength to feel relieved. The thing was dead. I stood there staring at its body, unable to comprehend what I had just fought. It lay crumpled in the dirt, its limbs twisted at odd angles, its flat face staring up at the sky with an expression that almost seemed human. I don't know how long I stood there staring at it, the weight of everything crashing down on me. I wanted to feel something, relief, fear, anger, but all I felt was numb. The creature was dead. It had to be over. But then I noticed something strange. The heads, the deer and the human, were gone. I looked around frantically, searching for any sign of them, but they had disappeared, vanished without a trace. My gut twisted. I knew the creature was dead. Its body was lying right in front of me. But those heads, someone had taken them. And that meant there was more to this than I had ever imagined. The authorities showed up the next day, after I managed to drag myself to town, bloodied and half out of my mind. They didn't believe me. Not at first. No one wanted to believe the ramblings of a half-crazy mountain man who claimed to have killed some unknown creature in the woods. But when they saw the body, when they saw the thing I had shot, they couldn't deny it anymore. They took the body away, wrapped it in tarps, loaded it into an unmarked van. No questions asked, no explanations given. The town sheriff didn't look me in the eye when they left. No one did. I don't know what that thing was or why it was out there. But I know one thing for sure. It wasn't the only one. And whatever else is lurking in those woods, it's still out there. I never imagined a trip to visit an old college friend could go so wrong. But here I am, wishing I had taken another route. It was 1999, and I was driving through rural West Virginia, on my way to see Kurt, an old buddy from back in the day. We hadn't spoken in a few years, and it felt like the right time to catch up. I've always been the type who likes the back roads, avoiding the main highways to soak in the quiet, desolate beauty of places people seem to forget. My name's Riley Grant, and if you ever find yourself tempted to take a wrong turn, don't. I spent my life avoiding the conventional, but sometimes sticking to the beaten path isn't so bad. It started out fine. I was making good time, but something about the road ahead felt off. I'd been driving for hours, and the gas station attendant back in Fairmont warned me about those folks who live deep in the hollers. I laughed it off, but as I drove farther into the woods, something gnawed at me. The trees grew thicker, pressing in like the mountains themselves were watching. There was no sign of civilization, and my GPS had lost signal a while back. Still, I kept going. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the sense that Kurt lived in places like this, and I wanted to show up with a story of my own. Stupid. The road narrowed, turning from asphalt to dirt. My tires kicked up dust, and the woods grew darker as the sun dipped behind the peaks. It was quiet, too quiet. Not even the usual chirp of birds or hum of insects. I checked my phone, no service, of course. The first sign that something was seriously wrong was when I saw the truck. It was an old beat-up Ford, rusted out and sitting lopsided on the side of the road. A few bullet holes pocked the side. It looked abandoned, but something told me it wasn't. I slowed down but didn't stop, rolling past cautiously. Then I noticed the smell, heavy and rancid like something had died nearby. I should have turned around right then, should have thrown the car in reverse and gunned it back to Fairmont. But I didn't. Instead, I pressed on, trying to convince myself it was just a dead deer or some old trash left to rot in the woods. Another few miles in, I came to a fork in the road. There was no signpost, no indication of where each path led. One dirt track seemed narrower than the other, winding deeper into the thick forest. I hesitated, glancing at the clock. 5:15 p.m. Kurt was expecting me around 6, but at this rate I'd be late. I turned right, hoping it was the right decision. The trees grew denser, blocking out what little light remained. My headlights cut through the dark, but the beam felt shallow, barely touching the edges of the road. That's when I saw movement. It was subtle at first, just a shadow darting between the trees. I slowed the car, peering into the woods, but there was nothing there. Maybe it was a deer. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks. I pressed the gas, urging the car forward. But the shadow came back, closer this time. I caught the glint of something, a reflection, maybe a piece of metal or glass. My stomach tightened, and I sped up, trying to shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there. The road kept winding, twisting like a snake through the underbrush. It felt endless, like I'd driven into a maze. That's when I saw the house. It sat back from the road, hidden behind a wall of overgrown bushes and tall, crooked trees. The roof sagged and the windows were dark, but there was a faint plume of smoke rising from a makeshift chimney. The place didn't look abandoned, but it didn't look lived in either. Something told me to keep driving, but I couldn't. My curiosity got the better of me, and I stopped the car just beyond the house, leaving the engine running. I don't know why, but I had to see who lived there. Maybe they had a map, or at the very least they could tell me how far I was from any kind of town. I left the car running, stepping out onto the road. The forest felt heavy, oppressive. My footsteps crunched against the gravel, each step louder than the last. As I approached the house, I noticed something hanging from the trees, old animal bones strung up like decorations. They swayed gently in the breeze, rattling like wind chimes made of death. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. This was a mistake. But before I could turn back, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate, and getting closer. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Someone was there, just out of sight. I turned slowly, and that's when I saw them. 3 figures standing at the edge of the woods, just beyond the reach of the headlights. They were tall, lanky, their faces obscured by shadows, but I could see enough to know they weren't friendly. One of them stepped forward, a man with a wild tangle of hair and skin that looked like it hadn't seen sunlight in years. He grinned, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too jagged. His clothes were tattered, stained with something dark. "Lost?" he asked, his voice rough like gravel. I didn't answer. My brain screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The man tilted his head, sizing me up like prey. "You shouldn't be here." I took a step back, my mouth dry, the taste of fear bitter on my tongue. "I was just looking for directions," I stammered, glancing at my car still idling on the road. The man's grin widened. "Directions? Sure, we can help." Before I could react, the other 2 figures stepped forward. One of them, a woman with matted hair and a missing eye, carried what looked like a hatchet. The other, a younger man, held a length of rusty chain. They moved in unison, like a pack, slowly closing the distance between us. I bolted. I didn't even think. I just ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. Behind me I heard them, laughing, the sound of feet pounding the dirt as they gave chase. My car was still running, the headlights barely visible through the trees, but I didn't dare turn around. I reached the car, yanking the door open and throwing myself inside. My hand shook as I slammed it into reverse, the tires spinning out on the dirt. They were close now, their shadows dancing just beyond the reach of the headlights. The car lurched backward, and I floored it, the engine screaming as I shot down the road. In the rearview mirror, I saw them standing in the middle of the road, watching as I sped away. But something told me they weren't done. For the next 20 minutes, I drove like a madman, taking every turn too fast, ignoring the branches that scraped against the sides of the car. The road seemed to stretch on forever, winding deeper and deeper into the wilderness. I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see them behind me, but there was nothing. That's when I saw the light. It was faint at first, barely a flicker on the horizon. But as I got closer, it grew brighter, more distinct. It was a fire burning in the middle of the road. A signal, a trap. I slowed the car, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The fire was surrounded by figures, 5, maybe 6 of them, and standing in front, holding something in his hand, was the man from before. His grin was gone now, replaced by something darker. He raised the object in his hand, a rifle. I slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The shot rang out, shattering the windshield. I ducked, feeling the glass spray across my face. The car veered off the road, crashing into the trees. My head slammed against the steering wheel and everything went black. When I came to, the car was a wreck, smoke billowing from the engine. My head throbbed and blood dripped down my face. I tried to move, but my body screamed in protest. Through the shattered windshield I could see them approaching, slow, deliberate, like they had all the time in the world. I fumbled for the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me as they drew closer, their faces twisted in anticipation. The woman with the hatchet was in the lead now, her one good eye gleaming in the firelight. I was going to die. But then, out of nowhere, a sound. The distant wail of a siren. They froze, their heads snapping toward the noise. It was faint, but growing louder. A police car, or an ambulance. Someone was coming. The man cursed under his breath, motioning to the others. "Next time," he growled, turning back toward the woods. The others followed, disappearing into the trees like they were never there. I sat in the wreckage, my heart pounding in my chest as the siren grew closer. I sat there, my breath coming in shallow gasps, unable to fully comprehend what had just happened. Blood trickled down the side of my face, and my hands shook uncontrollably as I stared through the shattered windshield. My mind was a chaotic mess, trying to process the fact that I was still alive, that somehow I had made it through. The sirens grew louder, and soon the flashing red and blue lights broke through the darkness. A police car skidded to a stop just a few yards away, kicking up dust and leaves. 2 officers rushed out, their flashlights cutting through the gloom, making quick work of assessing the scene. One of them, a tall, gruff man with a salt and pepper beard, knelt by the door and peered in at me. "You okay, son?" he asked, his voice gravelly but not unkind. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I was okay. They were right there. There were people. They tried to kill me. The officer glanced around, his brow furrowing as he scanned the surrounding forest. People? What kind of people? I swallowed hard, trying to gather my thoughts. I don't know. They weren't normal. There was a man, a woman, some others. They were all, I don't know how to describe it. They were hunting me. The second officer, a younger guy with wide eyes, stepped closer, shining his light toward the trees. "You sure about that? We didn't see anyone when we pulled up." "They were right there," I insisted, pointing toward the woods where I had last seen them disappear. "They shot at me, wrecked my car. I'm telling you, they're out there." The older officer exchanged a glance with his partner, clearly skeptical, but he didn't dismiss me outright. All right. Let's get you out of here first. You're banged up pretty bad. We'll figure the rest out." He pried the door open with a grunt, and I stumbled out of the wreckage, my legs feeling like jelly. The pain in my head throbbed, but it was nothing compared to the terror still clawing at my gut. I could feel their eyes on me. Those people watching from somewhere in the darkness, waiting for the officers to leave. I had no doubt they would be back if I didn't get out of there fast. The younger officer radioed for an ambulance, and within minutes I was being loaded onto a stretcher. The paramedics checked my vitals, cleaning up the blood from my forehead and asking me questions I barely registered. My mind was still fixated on the woods, on the people lurking just out of sight. I kept expecting them to show up again, to finish what they'd started, but they didn't. The officers remained behind, shining their flashlights through the trees, speaking in low voices to each other, but they didn't seem concerned. As if they thought I was just some guy who had lost control of his car and made up a wild story in the heat of the moment. I wanted to scream at them, to make them understand the danger, but I was too exhausted to argue. The paramedics drove me to the nearest hospital, where they treated my injuries. Nothing too serious, just some cuts and a mild concussion. The doctors asked me how it had happened, and I gave them the same story. But like the officers, they didn't seem to believe me. It was all too outlandish, too bizarre to make sense. People like that didn't exist, they said. This kind of thing didn't happen. I knew better. When the doctors were done, they let me rest for a few hours in one of the hospital's quieter rooms. It was after midnight by the time they discharged me, giving me strict instructions to take it easy for the next few days. I left the hospital on foot. My car was a wreck, and I wasn't about to try and hitch a ride this late at night. The thought of getting into another stranger's vehicle sent shivers down my spine. I walked out into the cool night air, the lights of the small town blinking dully around me. It felt surreal being back in civilization after what had happened in the woods. The streets were quiet, only the occasional passing car breaking the stillness. I wasn't sure where to go or what to do next. I had nowhere to stay, no way to contact Kurt, and no plan. So I just started walking. As I wandered through the sleepy streets, the events of the night played on repeat in my mind. The house, the people, the chase, the crash. It all felt like a fever dream, but I knew it had been real. Every step I took felt heavier than the last, as if something dark and unseen still clung to me, following in the shadows. After a while, I found myself at the edge of town, near a 24-hour diner. The neon sign flickered, casting an eerie glow over the parking lot. My stomach growled, and I realized I hadn't eaten in hours. I headed inside, desperate for some sense of normalcy. The place was nearly empty, just a trucker at the counter and a waitress refilling his coffee. I took a seat at a booth near the window and ordered something simple, a burger and fries, just to get something in me. The waitress was friendly enough, but I could tell by the look on her face that she was curious. I must have looked rough, with my bandaged head and the dried blood on my shirt. "You all right, hon?" she asked, pouring me a cup of coffee. "Yeah," I muttered. "Just had a rough night." She nodded, but I could tell she wanted to ask more. Thankfully, she didn't push it. I wasn't ready to explain. Not yet. I ate in silence, staring out the window at the empty street, the flicker of the neon sign keeping me company. For the first time since the wreck, I started to relax. Maybe it was the warmth of the diner, or the fact that there were other people around, but for a brief moment, I let myself believe that I was safe. And that's when I saw them. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but there, across the street, standing just beyond the reach of the streetlight, were the same three figures. The man, the woman, and the younger one, all watching from the shadows. My heart sank, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. They had followed me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It was like time had frozen, and all I could do was stare at them through the glass. They didn't move, didn't approach, but I could feel their presence, heavy, oppressive, like a weight on my chest. The waitress came by to refill my coffee, and when I blinked, they were gone. Just like that. But I knew they hadn't really left. They were out there, waiting, watching. I threw some cash on the table and bolted out of the diner, my pulse racing. I didn't know where to go, but I couldn't stay there. Not with them so close. As I hurried down the street, my mind raced with possibilities. How had they found me? What did they want? And why hadn't they finished the job when they had the chance? I rounded a corner and came face to face with the younger man from the group. He was standing in the middle of the sidewalk, his face illuminated by the dim light of a nearby street lamp. His eyes were cold, empty, and he didn't say a word. Just stood there blocking my path. Before I could react, something hit me hard from behind, a blow to the back of my head. I stumbled, the world spinning as I fell to the ground. My vision blurred and I tried to get up, but a boot came down on my chest, pinning me to the pavement. Should have stayed on the main road, the younger man muttered, his voice low and menacing. I struggled to breathe, my mind clouded with panic. This was it. They were going to kill me right here on the street, and no one would know. No one would care. But then I heard something. A voice, someone shouting. I looked up just in time to see a flash of light, bright and blinding, and the weight on my chest disappeared. The world tilted as I was pulled to my feet, my body feeling like dead weight. Through the haze of pain and confusion, I caught a glimpse of a figure. A man, older, with a badge glinting in the streetlight. The older police officer. He grabbed me by the arm, half dragging me down the street as the younger man and his group scattered into the night. They didn't chase us this time. They knew when they'd lost. "Let's get you out of here," the officer muttered, his grip firm but not unkind. I didn't ask questions. I just followed, my legs barely able to carry me as we made our way to his cruiser. He didn't say much after that, just kept glancing over his shoulder like he expected them to come back. When we reached the car, I collapsed into the back seat, my head pounding, my body bruised and battered. The officer drove in silence, taking back roads I didn't recognize, and after what felt like hours, we pulled up to a small cabin tucked away in the woods. "Stay here," he said, his voice gruff but gentle. "I'll take care of it." I didn't argue, didn't question why he had taken me to some remote cabin in the middle of nowhere. All I knew was that I was safe for the moment. As I sat there in the dark, waiting for whatever came next, I couldn't help but wonder how deep this all went. Who were those people? Why had they chosen me? And how had the officer known where to find me? I'll never get those answers. But I'm alive, and sometimes that's enough. It's funny how quiet your life can get when you're out in the woods for months on end, only to be shattered by one wrong call. That's what I told myself as I stood there, boots sinking into the wet mud of a place I had no business being. In retrospect, I should have known better. Should have known that no call on a dead-end dirt road ever ends with a smile and a pat on the back. It was 1996 in the middle of nowhere, Washington State. My name's Evan Krause, and I've been a ranger for the better part of a decade. Good job, honestly. Lots of time alone out in nature, no boss breathing down your neck. That was until the day dispatch sent me down a forgotten trail near Skookum Meadows. Something about missing campers. I hate that term, you know? Missing. It's just the polite way of saying, we're not sure what's left of them. The thing is, these woods are old. They have a reputation, passed down through folks who've lived near the fringes for far too long. You'd get stories from people, strange sightings, animals that don't quite fit, but that's just talk, right? Besides, I'm a ranger. I deal in facts, not folklore. That morning, the sky looked like it might drop a bucket or two of rain on me, but I figured it was nothing I hadn't dealt with before. My truck rumbled down a road so narrow that the branches scraped the sides like skeletal fingers. After parking at the base of the trail, I radioed in that I was starting my search. Alone. No backup, no extra gear. And sure, maybe I didn't bring a gun because nothing really happens out here, right? Besides, who needs it? The job's dangerous, but not that kind of dangerous. That's what I told myself. After an hour of hiking deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to crowd in closer, as if the woods themselves were alive and ready to swallow me whole. I stopped to take a piss by an old moss-covered log when I first smelled it. The unmistakable stench of rot, like roadkill left too long in the sun. But there wasn't anything around me, just thick woods. Still, that smell clung to the air like it was trapped in the trees themselves. The further I walked, the worse it got. Then I found the first sign that something wasn't right. Campfire remnants, charred wood. But no tents, no bags, nothing. Just ashes, scattered like someone had stomped out the fire in a hurry. That's when I started noticing the footprints. Human, but not right. Too large, and the spacing between them suggested a limp, or maybe something heavier. Maybe a prank, I thought, but deep down, I knew better. I knelt to get a closer look at the tracks, and that's when I heard it. A wet, crunching sound, not too far ahead. I didn't want to admit it, but my heart was pounding. I'm not the type to scare easy, but there's something primal that sets in when you hear a noise like that, out there where no one's supposed to be. I didn't have much of a choice but to follow. Stepping lightly, I moved toward the noise, gripping my flashlight like it was a weapon. After what felt like an eternity, I found the source. A clearing, and in the middle of it, a mass that used to be a person. Torn apart, like a deer shredded by coyotes. Only this wasn't animals. No claw marks, no bite marks. Just ripped limbs and open flesh, scattered like a butcher's floor. The face was gone, chewed beyond recognition, but from the ripped-up clothes, I guessed it was one of the campers. Then I saw the real problem. What had done this was still there, squatting low by the tree line, its back to me. It looked almost human, but hunched over, too large, and with skin that stretched tight over bones in ways that didn't make sense. The smell hit me again, stronger now, like meat left in the sun for days. I don't know what possessed me to stay still, but I froze. The thing was gnawing on something, maybe part of the body, I couldn't tell. My breath caught in my throat, and I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't any animal I'd ever seen. Suddenly, it stopped chewing. The crunching sound halted and there was silence. It turned its head slightly, not all the way, just enough for me to see that it wasn't right. Its neck didn't move the way it should have, and the part of its face I could see was more skeletal than anything else, like it had been stripped down to the bone. I backed up slowly, trying not to step on any twigs or leaves. My body was screaming to run, but my brain kept reminding me that running was how you got killed. That thing was still crouched, still gnawing, but I knew the second it turned around, it would be over for me. I needed to get back to my truck. Now. I stepped back once, twice, and then there it was, a snap of a twig under my boot. It's the kind of sound you hear in movies, the kind that makes everyone scream at the screen. But this was real. The thing straightened up, towering over the remains, and turned its head fully toward me. Its eyes, or what was left of them, weren't looking. They were just there, hollow, blackened, as if they'd rotted out long ago. I didn't wait to see what it would do. I bolted, sprinting back down the path, lungs burning, heart slamming in my chest. The sound behind me told me it was coming. Heavy, lumbering steps, too fast for something that size. I didn't dare look back. There's some survival instinct in all of us, some part of our brains that tells us not to do the stupid thing, like glance over your shoulder at the monster that's chasing you. So I ran. The forest blurred past me as I cut through the brush, ignoring the path, just trying to get away. I could hear it gaining, the sound of its movements closer, almost upon me. The thought hit me. What if it wasn't hunting? What if it was just toying with me? Some kind of sick game. Suddenly the ground fell out from beneath me. My foot caught on something and I went down, face first into the dirt. I barely managed to get back up when it hit me. A blow, hard and fast, knocking the wind out of me. The thing had slammed into me like a truck. I rolled, gasping for air, and finally saw it up close. Its skin was translucent in some places, and what looked like muscle fibers were stretched across its ribs, exposed. It was half-rotted, like a corpse that had clawed its way out of the ground but kept on moving. It didn't roar, didn't snarl, just stood there staring at me, as if deciding what to do next. I scrambled for something, anything to use as a weapon, but all I could feel was the slick mud beneath my hands. The thing lunged. I rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding its grasp, and crawled backward as fast as I could, my back hitting a tree. Then I heard it, another sound, This one human, a shout maybe, something I hadn't expected. In the distance, I saw a figure rushing toward me. Another ranger. Nate. He had a rifle and he was yelling something, but all I could focus on was the gun. He fired. The shot echoed through the trees and the thing jerked, stumbling backward. Another shot. This time it went down, twitching, spasming like some giant insect. We didn't wait to see if it would get up. Nate grabbed my arm and yanked me to my feet. We bolted toward the trucks, the forest echoing with silence behind us. We didn't stop until we were both locked inside the vehicle, breathing hard, staring out at the trees, waiting for something to follow us. But nothing did. We sat there in the truck, windows rolled up, rain pattering against the roof. Neither of us said a word. Eventually, Nate broke the silence. He asked if I'd ever seen anything like that before. I shook my head. We didn't report it. We couldn't. Who would believe it? A thing like that, half-rotten, human but not, walking around the forest eating people? No one would. But that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was the fact that it was still out there. Not moving, sure, but not gone either. And we didn't bury it. We didn't burn it. We left it there in the woods because sometimes the things you find out here don't leave. And I'll tell you this much. I'm never going back to Skookum Meadows. Not again. In 1998, I was living in the small town of Red Ash, Tennessee, which, as far as I could tell, existed solely to trap lost souls like myself. You know the type. People who weren't running from anything dramatic, just sick of the grind, of cities where the air feels like concrete and you forget what stars look like. I was no mountain man, but I liked the idea of isolation, of not having to look anyone in the eye. I told myself I'd figure things out here, get back to being me, as if I knew who that was. My name's Darnell Higgins, and back then, I had more time than sense. I had found an old rental cabin tucked at the base of the Appalachian Mountains. It was the kind of place where the floorboards squeak with every step, and you can hear the wind whistling through the cracks in the walls at night. Not that I minded. What I did mind was the nagging sense that I had come to the wrong place to escape anything. The town was quiet, too quiet for comfort. There were always a few locals hanging out near the town store or the gas station, but none of them talked much. When they did, it was the kind of low murmur you couldn't quite make out, like they were discussing you in a language they didn't want you to understand. I'd nod at them, flash a smile, but it never landed. It was fine, though. I liked it better that way. Kept things simple. One day I wandered into Old Joe's hardware store, a little rickety building on the edge of town. I wasn't in there for anything in particular, just needed to pass the time. Joe, a grizzled old man with the kind of face that looked like it had weathered every storm, was behind the counter. His white mustache twitched when I walked in. "You ain't from around here," he grunted, sizing me up. "Guessing you're out at McCready's place?" I nodded, figuring there was no point in denying it. The town was small enough that everyone knew where everyone stayed. "Yeah, that's the one," I replied, pretending to be interested in some dusty old tools hanging on the wall. Joe eyed me for a moment longer before he gave a low chuckle. "You might want to keep your windows closed at night," he said, as if it was some kind of joke. "A lot of strange animals up in them hills." Strange animals, right? I brushed him off, muttering a thanks and getting out of there before he could say anything else. The last thing I needed was to start believing local ghost stories or whatever it was he was getting at. I should have listened. The first sign that something wasn't right came that evening, just after sundown. I had settled into a routine of reading on the porch as the light faded, letting the cricket's steady chirping lull me into a sense of peace. But that night something was different. The sounds stopped. All of them. Not a cricket, not a bird, nothing. Just a silence so thick it pressed down on me. Then, a rustling came from the trees. I glanced up, squinting into the dark, expecting to see maybe a deer or a stray raccoon. Instead, I saw a shape moving in the underbrush. It was low, almost slithering across the forest floor, but too big to be anything I could easily explain. My pulse quickened, but I convinced myself it was just some wild dog or a coyote. I got up, headed inside, and locked the door. I wasn't exactly armed. Hadn't really thought I needed to be. I mean, who was going to bother a guy like me out here? I wasn't rich, didn't have anything worth taking. My only weapon was a rusty hatchet I found out back, left behind by some previous tenant. I kept it by the door just in case. That night I hardly slept. The sounds of scratching, slow and deliberate, started around midnight, dragging along the outside walls of the cabin. There was a shuffling sound, like something pacing just beyond the porch. I didn't dare move. I kept my eyes squeezed shut, breathing shallowly, hoping it would just go away. The next morning, I checked around the cabin, trying to make sense of the noises. Nothing seemed out of place, but the ground was soft from rain, and I saw it. A set of tracks leading from the edge of the woods right up to my porch steps. They were deep, heavy impressions, unlike any animal prints I'd ever seen. They almost resembled a wolf's, but larger, much larger. Now, I've never been the type to believe in monsters or anything like that, but those prints were wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever made them was watching me. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was a big dog or a black bear, but that didn't explain the pacing. The way the scratching felt so intentional. I went back into town that afternoon, feeling the tension crawl up my spine like ants. At the gas station, I ran into Joe again. I didn't want to bring it up, didn't want to seem like the paranoid outsider, but the words tumbled out before I could stop them. There were tracks, I muttered, leaning against the counter. Outside the cabin last night, too big for any animal I know. Joe's face darkened. He didn't ask questions, didn't look surprised. Instead, he nodded once, slowly, like he'd been expecting this. "Whatever it is," he said, voice low, "it comes down from the hills when it's hungry. Mostly keeps to itself, but sometimes it gets curious." I stared at him, waiting for him to laugh, to tell me I was being ridiculous. But the way he said it chilled me more than the prints themselves. I asked him what it was, but he just shook his head. "Best not to know. Just keep your doors locked at night." That night I did more than lock my doors. I barricaded them with furniture, pushed the sofa up against the door, and sat there with the hatchet in my lap like some character out of a bad horror movie. I couldn't believe I was doing this, that I was actually scared of some animal, but the gnawing unease wouldn't leave me. Around 2 in the morning it started again. First the scratching, soft at first like it was testing the wood, then the sound of heavy breathing. Close, so close I thought it was inside with me. I held my breath, gripping the hatchet so tight my knuckles turned white. Whatever was out there, it wasn't leaving this time. There was a loud thud. Something was throwing itself against the front door. I nearly dropped the hatchet, my heart hammering in my chest. I tried to stay quiet, to think, but panic was creeping up fast. Another thud, louder this time. The doorframe shook under the weight of the impact, and then silence. I didn't move. I couldn't. The fear was like a vice around my throat, squeezing tighter with every second that passed. A minute later, there was a creak from the back of the cabin, a slow, deliberate sound that sent a shiver down my spine. I realized with growing horror that whatever it was had moved. It was at the back door now, testing that one. I had to get out. I couldn't just sit there waiting for this thing to break through. The only option was the window in the bedroom, the one that opened out to the small clearing behind the cabin. I grabbed my backpack, no time to pack, just whatever was already in there, and bolted for the window. The sound of the door splintering behind me nearly froze me in place. It was in. I heard the heavy thuds of footsteps, too fast and too heavy to be anything human. I flung open the window, forcing myself through the narrow opening and landing hard in the grass below. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see it. I sprinted through the woods, branches slashing at my face and arms, but I didn't care. I just had to get away, to put as much distance between me and that cabin as possible. The sound of those footsteps echoed in my ears, following me but never getting closer. Eventually I stumbled out onto the main road, my lungs burning from the effort. The thing, whatever it was, hadn't followed me out of the woods, but I could still feel its presence, like it was watching from the trees. When I got to town, I headed straight for Joe's store. I half expected him to laugh at me, to tell me I was imagining things, but he didn't. Instead, he just gave me a long, sad look. "You're not the first," he said. "Won't be the last either." I left Red Ash that day, packed up what little I had and didn't look back. But every now and then, I wonder how many others came after me. How many people rented that old cabin thinking they were just getting away from the world, only to find something worse waiting for them. Maybe Joe was right. Maybe it's best not to know what's up in those hills. But one thing's for sure. Next time someone tells me to keep my windows closed at night, I'm damn well listening. They say being a cop in a small town like this is boring, that it's all parking tickets, rowdy teenagers, and the occasional lost dog. Let me tell you, I'd take those slow days over what happened back in 2003. You ever deal with something so twisted that it makes you question why you ever took the job in the first place? Yeah, that's what I've been stuck with ever since that night. I'm Travis Kincaid, sheriff in Rock Hollow, a little spot in rural Kentucky that barely shows up on a map. I've been here for about 14 years now. Never imagined I'd still be in this dump after all this time. But, you know, sometimes life grabs you by the throat and keeps you right where you are. I came here to get away from, well, everything. My ex-wife, the lawsuit, the mess I made of my life. I needed to start fresh, and a small-town cop gig seemed like the perfect place to do that. For the most part, it was. Until it wasn't. The first hint that something was off that night came when I got a call from Donnie, the dispatcher. He's about as sharp as a butter knife, but he's good at his job. He told me that there were reports of some weird noises coming from the woods on the north side of town, near the old Peterson place. Normally, I'd chalk it up to coyotes or maybe even a drunk or two stumbling around, but there was something in Donnie's voice that made me sit up. He sounded nervous, which was odd. Donnie never gets nervous. "Travis, you should probably check it out," he said, his voice shaking a little. I grabbed my flashlight, the standard issue Glock from the station, and headed out. My squad car rattled down the dirt road leading out of town, the radio static filling the silence. The Peterson place had been abandoned for years after Old Man Peterson passed, and no one had any interest in buying it. The locals said the land was cursed, but honestly I figured it was just the typical small-town nonsense. As I pulled up to the house, something felt wrong. The air was thick, heavier than usual. You know how people say you can feel a storm coming? It was like that, but more sinister. I turned off the engine and stepped out, my boots crunching on the gravel. The woods loomed on either side of the old house, branches twisting together like skeletal fingers. Yeah, it was creepy, but I'd been a cop long enough not to let it get to me. Not yet, anyway. I did a sweep of the area, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The house was still and silent, the windows like dead eyes staring back at me. I circled around the back where the woods met the yard, and that's when I heard it. The faintest sound, like something dragging across the forest floor. I stopped dead in my tracks. It was subtle, almost like the wind, but it wasn't. I knew it wasn't. "Anyone there?" I called out, more for my own sanity than anything else. No response. Just that dragging sound again, but this time closer. Too close. I moved toward the tree line, my heart thudding a little faster than I'd like to admit. I shined the flashlight into the woods, the beam bouncing off the undergrowth. That's when I saw it, or part of it. At first I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer, but the way it moved wasn't right. It was crouched low to the ground, long limbs stretched out in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its movements were jerky, unnatural. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. That's when it turned toward me. It wasn't human, I mean it had human-like features, but distorted. Its arms were too long, its legs bent backward like a dog's. And its face, God, its face. It was stretched, almost like someone had taken a normal face and pulled it over something else. Something wrong. I don't know if it was the panic or sheer disbelief, but I froze. In all my years as a cop, I'd never felt fear like that. Not even when I had a gun pointed at my head during a drug bust back in the city. This was different. This was primal. Then it moved. Fast, like a damn blur. 1 second it was crouching in the shadows, and the next, it was charging at me, its limbs flailing wildly. I barely had time to react. My body kicked into autopilot, years of training taking over as I drew my Glock and fired off a few rounds. The shots echoed through the trees, loud and sharp in the still night. The thing stopped, staggered for a second, then let out this noise. I won't call it a scream because it wasn't that. It was more like a gurgle, a choking rasp that made my stomach twist. It didn't fall. It didn't die. It just kept coming. Slower now, but still moving toward me with those dead black eyes fixed on mine. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a root, but somehow managed to stay on my feet. I fired again, aiming for its head this time. The bullet hit its mark. I saw the spray of blood, saw its head jerk back, and for a moment I thought I had it, but it didn't go down. It just stood there, swaying, its face a bloody mess, but still alive. I swear to God, it smiled at me. I turned and ran. I didn't even think about it. I just ran back to my car, my heart pounding so hard I thought it'd explode out of my chest. I could hear it behind me, that dragging sound getting faster, like it was gaining on me. I made it to the car, slammed the door shut and floored it. The tires kicked up gravel as I sped down the road, not looking back. I didn't sleep that night. Hell, I haven't slept much since. The thing about small towns is word gets around. People started talking about what I saw, rumors spreading like wildfire. Most folks didn't believe me. They thought I'd gone off the deep end, that the stress of the job had finally gotten to me. But a few knew better. They'd heard stories, whispers about things in the woods, things that weren't quite right. I tried to put it behind me, to go back to the routine, but every time I closed my eyes I saw that face, that smile. It wasn't until a week later that the body turned up. Old Joe Barnes, a farmer who lived on the outskirts of town, found it while he was out checking his traps. It was torn apart, limbs scattered like broken branches. The look on Joe's face when he told me about it said everything I needed to know. Whatever I had seen, it was still out there. And it was killing. We never found out what it was. The official report blamed it on a wild animal, probably a wolf or a bear, but I knew better. I'd seen it. I'd shot it. And it didn't die. For months I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, waiting. But then, as quickly as the killing started, they stopped. The town went quiet again, and life moved on. People forgot. I didn't. I don't go near those woods anymore. It's not that I'm scared. At least that's what I tell myself. But there's something about that night that still haunts me. Something I can't quite put into words. Maybe it's the way the air felt, thick and heavy, like the world was holding its breath. Maybe it's the way that thing looked at me, like it knew something I didn't. Or maybe it's just that smile, that twisted, bloody smile that's burned into my memory. Either way, I'm done with Rock Hollow. I put in for a transfer, someplace quiet, someplace far away from here. Let someone else deal with the weird noises in the woods. Let someone else see what I saw. Because I'm not going back. Not ever.